Good morning, everybody. I think we're about ready to start, as some people are probably still coming into the room. Sophie, my colleague, can you put the slides in presentation mode, please? Anyway, let's start. On behalf of the co-organizers, Manusher Jonno Foundation, Coast Trust and BILS in Bangladesh, and the Danish Institute for Human Rights, and all of our speakers who are with us and will speak today, I welcome you all to this webinar. We have been looking very much forward to it, and I can promise our audience that we have a very good lineup of speakers here with us. So I do think we will have the opportunity to have some interesting joint reflections and exchanges. I hope we can make it as interactive as possible on this platform. Even though we're not in the same room, we do look forward to engaging with you guys who are out there, and hope to have your questions, maybe even reflections, shared on the chat when we get to the Q&A sessions of the day's program. In the Danish Institute for Human Rights, we started working on fisheries a few years ago. We did that because we believe that only through alignment of policies and practice with human rights standards can the fisheries and agriculture sectors become truly sustainable. In line with recent decades of sustainable development, the sustainable development paradigm, where we increasingly see that the global thinking around sustainability encompasses both the environmental aspect and the social aspect. And in order to achieve that social sustainability, we believe that human rights are the tools that we need to align our policies and practice with. So these are this is the point of departure for us as a national human rights institution to work on fisheries. And it's a point of departure for us to have gathered the people that we have with us today to explore the issue of human rights and dignity in the small-scale fisheries sector. Before we really start, I should also say that our work on fisheries forms part of our cooperation with SIDA, the Swedish Development Agency, who are generously supporting us to develop this work, to have these kinds of dialogues and events, shared thinking with the experts from around the world on how we can leverage the human rights framework to promote the rights and dignity, well-being of small-scale fishers. We do this as part of our broader work on human rights and sustainable development, where we look very closely at the 2030 agenda and its goals and targets, and how we can again leverage the human rights potential that is in the agenda, given the fact that the targets under the agenda are closely aligned with international human rights standards. So this much just to set the framework on why we as a human rights institution are here today with all of you. And again, welcome. I see we have more participants coming in. That is great to see. Welcome to all of you, and welcome again to our speakers. Sophie, can you change the slide? Yes, thank you. And can you put it in presentation mode? We still see the left hand.
There is a technical problem with my computer, I think. So it is in presentation mode on my end. So
anyway,
we have to live with that.
This is the limitations of what that we have to live with. Great. It looks better now. Thanks, Sophie. Before we move on to starting our series of presentations, let me briefly go through the program. We've made some slight tweaks and changes since you last saw it, but you will recognize it, I believe. We will start with a presentation from our colleague Manas Roshan from the International Collective in Support of Fish Workers. He will do our fly-in to the small-scale fisheries sector, presenting trends and developments in the sector from recent years. After that, my colleague Sophie, who is also steering the slides, as you can hear, will set the scene on why we talk about human rights and fisheries, explaining how we can use human rights standards to promote the rights and dignity of small-scale fishers. After that, we have our first panel, which focuses on the human rights impact of fisheries policies and what measures are needed to protect the livelihood and dignity of small-scale fishers. And here we have two speakers, Sheikh Ghiyasuddin Ahmed from Bangladesh and Dr. Ibrahim Aziz from Senegal. And we have a Q&A session then, and this is important. This is where we want to engage with our participants, and we want you to come with your questions to the panelists, maybe even share reflections. And this is the time to use the chat that goes to everybody in this meeting. We kindly ask you to not use the chat too much otherwise when we're not in Q&A sessions, because it can be distracting for speakers as well as for the audience. But when we get to the Q&A sessions, please engage and share with us so that we can all share this virtual being together as much as we can under these circumstances that we work under here. Panel 2 is on the role of national human rights institutions. There we have had, unfortunately, one cancellation. Our colleague from Malaysia was not able to make it today. I will change my cap and step in and share some of the information that the colleagues from Malaysia were supposed to have shared, and add on a bit more on the broader human rights institution perspective. And then we have our colleague from the Philippines, Victor Joseph Obanil, who will share perspectives from the Commission on Human Rights in the Philippines. Again, we have a Q&A session. After that, we have the summing up and the important final remarks from the FAO, the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization, which holds the mandate to work with the fisheries sector globally, and work with governments on advancing policy developments, etc. In the end, then, of course, I will give a small closing remark, and we will say goodbye to each other. So this is what we have ahead of us. Sophie, please move on to the next slide. So you see here on the screen Manas Roshan from the International Collective in Support of Fish Workers. Manas, I hand over to you now to give your opening remarks on trends and developments in the sector in recent years. Over to you, Roshan.
Thank you, Silly. And thank you to the Danish Institute of Human Rights for organizing this, as well as the other co-organizers and my fellow panelists, and of course, TBTI for putting this great program together. And it's especially relevant to be a part of such a program, because while we know that the small-scale fisheries guidelines that we all work with are so rooted in the human rights-based approach, and human rights is so widely discussed in the UN systems and in the international processes, the crucial role of national human rights institutions such as DIHR and some of the others that are present here, both at the national and the international level, cannot be stressed more than. So I just want to start off, since the time is very brief, with just giving our room here an overview of what could anchor this discussion, though most of you are so aware of this information already. But we want to maybe situate the discussion in who we're talking about when we talk about small-scale fisheries. As you all know, the small-scale fisheries encompass all actors along what we call the fisheries value chain, working in the subsector, which is small-scale fisheries, which is full-time, part-time, occasional, subsistence, formal, informal, migrant fishers, and fish workers. And they include women, indigenous people, and other vulnerable and marginalized groups. And since we're talking about something as important as human rights and dignity, we also need to look beyond the entitlements that the sector's workers have as workers or employees, but also to their families, to the youth, to the children, to the elderly, to the disabled, and all other communities that we consider a part of the fishing communities. So just to give some background information on how important this sector is, and we'll hear from various actors in the sector in this webinar, but a data point that is often used about how 90% of all fishers in the primary sector of the small-scale fishery subsector are in fact employed in small-scale fisheries. So what you see is that for the per ton of catch coming from small-scale fisheries versus large-scale fisheries, much wider employment in the small-scale fisheries as opposed to the industrial fisheries for per ton of the catch. And this also translates to the importance that we see along the value chain of small-scale fisheries. So of the 120 million people dependent on the sector, women make up half the workforce, and the number goes up considerably when you consider just post-harvest fisheries, especially in certain developing countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And this importance of the sector, of course, is measured on various criteria, one of them being employment, the other on food security and well-being. And we all know how important the small-scale fisheries is to food security globally as well as locally. You go to the next slide, please. When we talk about human rights and dignity for small-scale fisheries, before we come to the actual instruments and the legal framework, which the very qualified people on this panel will talk more about, we need to talk about what are some of the vulnerabilities in the sector. And often when we talk about poverty from the view of the SDGs or in other international frameworks, we look at mainly the income poverty. But what we see with small-scale fisheries, as with many other sectors such as these, the discussion has to go beyond into a multi-dimensional idea of both poverty and destitution, as we talk about. So these involve vulnerabilities along social indicators and other human development indicators, which could be the access that they have to education, to healthcare and other social services, to social protection and social security measures, and the fact that they are a resource, a natural resource dependent community. So especially with the onset of climate change and the depletion and erosion of their ecosystems and biodiversity, these communities are increasingly fragile, and this translates to other forms of vulnerability and marginalization. What is also characteristic of the sector, especially in the developing world, is that fisheries is known to be among the most hazardous and dangerous jobs in the world, especially the work at sea, increasingly with the onset of an increasing frequency of disasters and meteorological disasters. You have the jobs of fishermen being increasingly difficult, but also on the coast, we see the vulnerabilities of the fishing community and the fish workers all along the value chain. Another issue, as will be pointed out in this session as well, is the unequal power relations, not just between various actors in the sector, but also between men and women engaged in the sector. We already know about how important women are to the small-scale fisheries value chain and to the communities, but their roles often are not recognized. They are poorly paid. Their jobs are often unstable and informal. And their other domestic work and all of their other contributions to this communities go unnoticed. In the context of SDG 14B, which we will come to, which is to facilitate or to provide access to small-scale fisheries, fish workers and fishers to resources, marine resources and markets, we need to talk about how volatile these markets are. and that our understanding of their value chains globally, locally, and at the regional level are highly, what do you say, in the gray as of now. We little information about how these fisheries value chains works, how their power imbalances are, and what are the various trade barriers as well that face the fish workers and fishing communities in the sector. Finally, just to come to what are the opportunities, and we'll go into these in detail. I'm sure Sophie and the others will talk about the wide range of legal instruments that are out there to protect the fishing communities in the world. But specifically, when we talk about marine fisheries and fish workers, we need to talk about some of the recent developments in, for example, the Work and Fishing Convention, which ensures decent work to fish workers on board fishing vessels at sea. This was endorsed in 2007 by the ILO conference, but what you now see in recent years, since 2015, is an increasing number of ratifications from the developing world. So that includes Angola, Congo, Morocco, Namibia, Senegal, and South Africa on the African continent. And we have Thailand, which is the only Asian country as of now to ratify this. And so these present a large number of opportunities for small-scale fishery stakeholders to ensure decent work, at least on the seaward side or the marine side for the sector. And then, of course, what is the basis of our discussion in this session as well as in the days to come, the SSF guidelines, the Bible as we have it for the civil society and other actors in this sector, which is founded on the human rights-based approach and makes that crucial link between the ecosystem-based approach and the importance of social development to ensure a holistic development in the sector and the well-being of fishing communities. And this language finds its way into many other processes, including the Sustainable Development Goals. And we have the SDG 14 specifically on life below water, but when we look at SDG 14B, the language for this really comes from the long series of legal instruments, from the Code of Conduct for Responsible Fisheries to the guidelines, and finally into the SDG process, ensuring that the access for small-scale fishers to both resources and markets is ensured. So to just sum up, what we see in the last 7 years since the endorsement of the SSF guidelines by the FAO Committee on Fisheries is the increasing visibility and recognition of the stakeholders in the sector, both men and women. And these go widely into various processes, including on climate change, biodiversity, and the latest discussion on the food systems, both in the Committee on Food Security as well as the wider UN Food System Summit discussions. We see increasing prominence of small-scale fisheries from a position when they were relatively unrecognized. And just this language is very important when we talk about the subsidies discussion, which many of you would be curious about, where we have a very positive language in the current draft text of the subsidies negotiations at the WTO, where there is a recognition that low-income, resource-poor, and livelihood-dependent fishers and fishing communities do require crucial subsidies to further their livelihoods. So with that, I'll just give the floor to the others. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Manas, for a comprehensive overview of trends and developments. I hand directly over to my colleague, Sophie Gry Fridal Hansen, who is an advisor at the Danish Institute for Human Rights and works with the intersection between human rights and sustainable development, and who has been working on our Sustainable Oceans project since we started in 2018. And in particular, Sophie works a lot with our partners in Africa. So over to you, Sophie. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Sille. I'm also looking at our YouTube channel where we have 10 people watching, and really great to see many good colleagues attending in this seminar. So as a direct continuation of Magnus's great presentation, we will now zoom in to really the human rights perspective. How can human rights, why and how can human rights standards and mechanisms be used by small-scale fishers to promote their livelihood and dignity? And the first and primary reason is that the human rights framework gives states some duties to protect the small-scale fishing communities. They have a legal obligation and a duty to respect and protect and fulfill the human rights of all, including small-scale fishers. These human rights, as you know, are defined in both international, regional, and national frameworks, and violations are subject for litigation in courts at various levels. Then we also know increasingly that there is a global consensus that companies are also expected to respect human rights of fishers and communities and also participate in mechanisms for remedy. This is established through the UN Guiding Principles and the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises in 2011. So there is this global expectation that companies should expect human rights and not violate or undermine human rights. And for the fishers and communities themselves, they can use the human rights standards and the provisions in the laws to claim improvements in their livelihood and to seek remedy when their rights are violated. Lastly, we are looking at a group of actors who have a mandate to promote and protect human rights, for instance, for example, national human rights institutions, and they can really help small-scale fishing communities by investigating and addressing specific issues, and also be supportive in mechanisms to seek remedy. So some of the typical rights that we see for small-scale fishers are the right to work and to free choice of employment, the right to an adequate standard of living, the right to a healthy environment, political rights, fundamental freedoms, right to equality and non-discrimination, labor rights, rights of indigenous peoples, and cultural rights. And as Magnus explained earlier, these rights have been really beautifully integrated into the small-scale fisheries guideline, and that is also a vehicle for promoting and protecting human rights of fishing communities. So this we know. Now it gets more interesting. We wanted to show some of the issues that human rights standards can help uncover, and also give you examples of existing human rights-based advocacy from around the world. So when we look at equality and non-discrimination, we know that human rights standards and, for instance, human rights impact analysis can help expose patterns of discrimination. This can be against small-scale fishers. It can be within small-scale fishing communities, such as women or indigenous peoples. And this right has been used in litigation in Iceland and South Africa, where small-scale fishers have claimed access to marine resources that they have lost with how the quotas was regulated. Another advocacy example based on human rights is recommendations given by the UN human rights systems to Morocco, calling for the state to have more transparency in how they're distributing fishing permits, and also really make strategies that targets the needs of disadvantaged and marginalized individuals and groups in Morocco. Another example on the right to an adequate standard of living. Oh, 2 seconds. Yeah. Is the issue that we heard that for many factors and reasons, small-scale fishers' access to marine resources and means of subsistence is really challenged in these years. Both as a result of overfishing, illegal fishing, IUU fishing, and climate change, and so on. So advocacy strategies here, for instance, in Senegal, where we hear recommendations that small-scale fishers should really have a meaningful and effective participation when the state is negotiating fisheries agreement, and also that small-scale fishers folk should have their access protected. And in Indonesia, from the human rights system, the government actually was given a recommendation to integrate a human rights-based approach into the fisheries laws and fisheries management. Last example before I conclude here and hand over, the issues on special measures, for instance, when states see that some communities are disadvantaged, they can give special measures to ensure equal treatment of this community. And we have recommendations in the Maldives from human rights organizations that women should have increased access to income generating opportunities through microcredits and loans because of this inequality in access. And again, there are rights for indigenous communities and litigation and recommendations in Norway and other countries. I will end here.
Thank you very much, Sophie, and thank you to both of you. I think it's clear that when we talk about the small-scale fisheries sector, it's a significant number of people we are talking about. It's a significant sector we're talking about, important for the food security. I think it's clear from what both of you say that there are multidimensional challenges of marginalization, violations of basic human rights, non-fulfillment of rights, etc. At the same time, there are positive messages that we need to hold on to in terms of increasing visibility of the small-scale fisheries sector, of the small-scale fishers, of their problems, the marginalization, the multidimensional problems they face. There's positive policy developments with the SSF guidelines, importantly with the Work in Fishing Convention, ILO Convention number 188, and wonderful that it is being increasingly ratified. I saw a question on the chat on whether it's unrealistic to promote small-scale fisheries, while in some countries the developments have turned towards more industrial-scale fisheries or large-scale fisheries, and what can be done to promote human rights in the industrial-scale fisheries sector, which is widely known for some of the worst human rights violations that we can even imagine. Lots of bonded labor, exploitation of the worst kind is in that sector. And I think the quick answer to that is promote ratification of ILO's Work in Fishing Convention. It speaks to that also. And otherwise, we can only say from the organizers' side, we agree that is an issue that needs to be dealt with. We work on that also with human rights institutions and other actors. In this seminar, however, we zoom in on the artisanal small-scale fisheries sector. So that is a choice in terms of how we framed this event. And there are tensions also, of course, in many countries between the two sectors, which is also one of the issues I believe we will talk about when we move on here today. So with this, I want to move on to our first panel. We have the first panel now on the human rights impacts of fisheries policies and what measures are needed to protect the livelihood and dignity of small-scale fishers. And we have two speakers with us. From Bangladesh, we have Sheikh Yasuddin Ahmed, who is a senior program manager and a research focal person in a very large NGO called the Manushya Jannu Foundation. Manushya Jannu Foundation works on on rights and dignity, promoting equality, etc. And they work with a lot of smaller civil society organizations. GEARS works with research activities, research capacity development of partner NGOs, program management, partnership management, etc. From the DIHR, we have cooperated, as I said in the beginning, the past 3 years with Manushya Journal Foundations and our 2 other partner organizations in Bangladesh, Coast Trust and BILS, on a sector-wide human rights impact assessment in the small-scale fisheries sector. And GEARS will present that in a short while. Before that, let me introduce our other speaker on this panel, Dr. Ibrahim Aziz from Senegal, who is a senior oceans campaign manager in Greenpeace Africa, and who is also associated with IPAR, an NGO that focuses on rural policy development, promotion of equity, etc., and dialogue around those issues. Dr. Ibrahim Aziz is an expert on fishery, food security, and environment issues, and he will speak about our study, which is again a study that we have cooperated around between DIHR and IPAR in Senegal, a study on artisanal fisheries and human rights in Senegal, and how the sector contributes to the achievement of SDG target 14B, which Manas introduced so well before, the target on small-scale fishers' access to marine resources and to markets. So with this introduction, I want to hand over the floor to you, GEARS, and Sophie, please change the slides. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sile. Can you hear me loud and clear? Okay, thank you. As Sile already stated, that we had done a sector-wide human rights impact assessment on the small-scale fishing communities of Bangladesh since 2018, and we have just completed the study and looking forward for taking the findings towards advocacy issues. We did a number of supplementary researches along with the sector-wide impact assessment to complement this study. That includes a study on the industrial sector, the shrimp sector, and also we had some assessments during the Corona period. We have annual ban of marine fishing for 65 days. So we did some assessments on those things also as part of the sector-wide impact assessment. And as per the findings from the study, we have divided or segmented the findings into 4 sections, like labor conditions, standard of living, rights of women, and the rights to a healthy environment. So let's begin with the labor conditions. And here we can see some photographs of the conditions of the fishermen in Bangladesh, especially the marine ones. So you can see from the photographs that fishermen are wading through deep mud, and also they are working on the boats, taking the fishes to the shore, and so on. So next slide, please. Yeah, and as per our study, we found that the fishers are not recognized as laborers under the labor law, the existing labor law of Bangladesh. They are not recognized as laborers. So they are. So it has been very difficult for them to claim some rights as laborers, and also the trade unionism has also been disrupted due to these problems. And as they are not recognized as laborers, they do not have contractual agreements, and mostly they work on verbal agreements, and they don't have any fixed working hours or working conditions or payments, etc. And during the study, we found that 80% fishermen feel that they have insufficient life-saving equipment on board, which is very dangerous for them while they're on the sea. And especially in a country like Bangladesh, where natural calamities are often happening. And half of the fishermen said that there is no warning system that reaches them at sea. So when at the sea, they cannot listen to the weather forecasts or anything like that. So they are endangered while in the sea. And 97% fishermen find that harbor facilities are not safe. This is a very difficult situation when they get back to harbor after fishing, and it is very narrow and very unsafe. So that's what they said. And during the fishing trips, there is a huge lack of adequate food and drinking water also, because they have to go to the sea for around 15 to 20 days, and they have to keep spaces for the fish they catch. So, and as these boats are not that large enough, so they have to restrict the amount of food they can take, food or water they can take. And approximately 1/3 of the fishermen said that they are underpaid. Uh, and almost the same portion of fishermen are caught in the debt, and that is kind of bonded labor kind of a situation, which is called in Bangla as dadon. We can say that they take loans from the boat owners, and they are bound to work for them until the loan is paid. And this is and regardless to say that they are not paid enough or something like that. And 83% respondents say that they work with crew members under age of 18. So there are some child labor also in this sector. So these are the labor conditions. So for the standard of living, you can see some photographs of the houses of the last slide, please. Okay, the photographs. Yeah. Thank you. And yeah, these are the photographs of some of the houses of the where the fishermen are living. And also, and the last photograph in the bottom right one, the last phone call before going to the voyage. It's a very touchy moment for the fishermen because their life is endangered while they're on sea. So next slide, please.
Yes, I'm sorry to interrupt. I need to ask you to make it a bit concise because we are a little bit behind time.
Sure,
and we need to Great.
Sure, okay, thank you. So from the part of a standard of living, almost all the fishermen reported fishing as their main source of income, and they do not does not generate enough money to cover their family's basic expenses, and they do not have other skills as well. And average income or annual income of the fishermen, that is US dollar 1,098, while the expenditure is US dollar 1,417. So they have some deficits, which is evident from here. And 1/3 respondents have annual income of less than US dollar 886. So they have to live very cheaply. And 30% reported water is not clear. Half reported drinking water taste of salt, and 56% of the respondents reported that families suffer from waterborne diseases. As you can see that the water is not clear and salty and dirty. And 80% respondents say that they have to pay for medical services. That is not free for them, and they have to buy the medical services. And 70% reported having lost half of their income or more during COVID-19 since last year, while 74% did not receive any social security allowances during this period. The lockdown situations during Corona, and also the 65 days ban. And 33% respondents reported having no income at all during the 65 days ban of 2020, and 90% reported having taken loans during the ban and getting into the vicious cycle of loan. And rights of women, women are, you can see there's some photographs of women fishing. And regarding the rights of women, women whose husbands work on fishing vessels live with a high degree of insecurity. They face physical violence and sexual violence as well. 75% of the female respondents who have experienced loss or grave injury of a husband, father, or son at sea did not receive any compensation, as those had not been recorded. And 40% manage with help from relatives and cut back on their own food intake to make ends meet. 26% stop sending their children to school once they lose their husband or father or son or the earning members. 68% of the female respondents report that they have experienced problems and harassment when male family members go to sea, which I earlier mentioned. 64% of the females interviewed claimed of making an income from post-harvest activities on land, such as such as cleaning the nets, sorting of fish, fish drying, and fish processing. 93% male respondents agree that women do not get equal pay. So that is also recognized by the men. And for the last part, the right of to a healthy environment, it is that around half of the fishers acknowledge overfishing lead to depletion of fish stock, which is happening by the industrial trawlers and also the artisanal fishers. 88% respondents said climate change caused a decrease in their income. And many also report that climate change has had negative impacts on the water quality and reduced the quality of drinking water. Changes in fish stock over the course of recent years may indeed be related to climate change-induced patterns of change in the ecosystem. It is recognized that states have a duty to protect the environment in order to live up to their obligations to protect and fulfill human rights. It also induces a duty to take special care to respect, protect, and fulfill the rights of those who are most at risk from environmental harm in a broader sense in defense of human dignity. And moving on to the policy recommendations based on the findings from the sector-wide impact assessment, we can say that the amendment in Labor Act 2006 is needed to ensure the right of the fishermen to organize themselves in trade unions, ratify ILO's work on fishing convention number 188 and 138, eliminate forced labor and bonded labor in the fisheries sector, which I earlier mentioned, establish a minimum wage board to establish a minimum wage for fishers, develop an enabling environment for productive empowerment of opportunities through relevant education and vocational training, especially during the lean season and during the ban periods. Secure small-scale fishers access to credit schemes and free them from the poverty trap of indebtedness to local money lenders, and recognize vital role of women in small-scale fisheries and promote their equal rights and opportunities as per FAO's guideline for sustainable small-scale fishers. Adopt science-based informed management plans for existing and newly proposed protected marine areas and critical ecological areas, and also reorganizing the ban period and reducing the period from 65 days to fewer days. So that's all from my part. Thank you, Sile, and over to you.
Thank you, Gias. Thank you for a marathon here, running through the quite comprehensive sector-wide impact assessment of the sector in Bangladesh. I hand over now to Ibrahim Aziz, our colleague from Senegal. And again, Ibrahim, I need to ask you to be concise. we are a bit behind schedule, so I will become a bit more strict from now on as a moderator and timekeeper. But we look forward to hearing from Senegal. Over to you, Dr. Ibrahima.
Thank you, Sila. I'll try to be very concise. Just thank you for organizing this and allowing us to share the things that's happening here in Senegal. Yeah, this work is come from a partnership between IPAR and National Institute of Human Rights. IPAR is a think tank, and for the first time we are addressing human rights in the particular sector of fishing sector, because in general human rights are working in other issues like democracy, freedom of speech, etc. But making this link between human rights and fishing sector is something that is really new. And we have tried really to see in the ground how this is impacting, what is the reality of fishermen. And by doing that, we are also focused on three aspects. The access to resource, because we were saying that we need to understand how the implementation, where are the implementation of SDG 14B particularly for access to resource and market. So we have assessed the access to resource, the access to resource. We have also focused on the participation on decision-making process and the right to work, the condition of working condition and the different right linked with that. Next slide, please. Yeah, and here in this slide, you have this real situation of the small-scale fishers in Senegal. The situation, for example, when we talk about respect for the rules of access to resource, we just realized that they have a lot of bad practice, let's say, bad fishing practice, and even there are some rules to have authorization, but there's a lot to do on this side. And the resource scarcity is also another issue, because when we talk about right to access, the resource should be there. But we just realized that most of the fishermen highlight that overfishing is an issue, bad fishing practice, new issue like exploitation of oil and gas, and foreign vessels that are acting also. And since when it started, most of them think more than 10 years now that this situation is happening, and we have a destruction of ecosystem, of exploitation, in pollution, bad fishing practice, IU fishing, increasing fishing effort. And here we have FAO recommendation that request decreasing the fishing effort to not put the stock in trade. And high demand of fish products and impact of climate change. So all these issues are also impacting in the right of fishermen to have access to resource. And there is also one important point is that the small scale fisher in Senegal, what can be done in this site is to follow the recommendation from the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And this recommendation focus on inequality because it's important to ensure the effective mobilization of domestic resources, and how there's an opportunity to develop more efficient and progressive and socially just fiscal policy that can increase the fees charged for foreign investor. So that maybe would be an opportunity to fight inequality and to allow those that are not, don't have such power, economic power to maybe grow and to have the same right, the same possibility to have access. The right of also adequate standard of living. Here the recommendation is to ensure the meaningful and effective participation of fisher in the negotiation. And here we are really focusing on the participation on the decision-making process, which is a big issue, because also when we did the field work and interview with fishermen, we just realized that they are not implicated in the decision-making process. They are not participating, and it's a big issue. And that's why we think that in Senegal, there's a lot to do for this site. There's a lot to do because most of the fishermen don't know, most of them don't even heard about SDG, or don't know that even they have right that must be defended, etc. So there's a lot to be done in this side. And for the human rights issue, the recognition of right to access to resource is something that maybe exists in the paper, in the constitution, but the effective implementation of this right is a big issue. The resolution of conflict, but mostly the fishermen communities used to manage themselves and to find a way to solve conflict. They have some consultation, transparency, when you think about FITI, about all the instruments that exist to improve the transparency, but countries are not very hurrying to join this initiative. And I have 2 minutes left. Recommendation for the SDG implementation based on human rights. We think that the state must ensure the implication of the labor code to workers, because the labor code is protecting really the fishermen. And if we have a real implementation of this labor code, it should be a good thing for artisanal fishermen in general. Also, the state must take appropriate measure to sense the support of local market, national or regional, and not just supporting the international market, because the difference between the both are very huge. A lot of effort was made to ensure that products that are exported are really complying with standard, while in the local market there was not so much effort, so much work to be done. So a lot must be done in this site, and I think that this is next slide. I think it's ending here. Sila? Yeah, just to say by concluding that here, what is important to just remind here is the instruments are very good, but a lot need to be done in the field to really ensure the implementation of instrument, and to ensure that fishermen know what we talk about, they understand it, and they can defend themselves when it's needed. So thank you, and over.
Thank you very much, Ibrahim Aziz. Very comprehensive presentation again. And thank you to both our panelists for stating some of the human rights issues in the sector. You have mentioned too many issues for me even to capture in a few sentences, but it's very clear that we have basic human rights are violated, labor rights are violated, policy development is needed, implementation, enforcement of policies and regulations is needed. You brought in, Ibrahima, at the end also the issue of resource scarcity, which we also need to acknowledge, also as human rights actors. And the human rights framework is actually evolving these years in around recognizing the human right to a healthy environment and operationalizing how to work with that and how to enforce states' duty to protect the environment and the resources for people's livelihoods to be secure, for the right to life to be respected, etc. We have the standards to promote dignity in the form of human rights and labor rights. We need to remind states, and we need to work with them. We will make a small change in the program. We are a bit behind schedule, and I want to make sure that our next panelists also gets the time that he has expected to get, and that we hear from you, Victor Urbanil. So we will push a bit the Q&A session. We will have questions and answers to panelists, but before we move to questions and answers, we will continue right away with panel 2 on the role of national human rights institutions in promoting and protecting the human rights of small-scale fishers. As I said in the beginning, we have had a cancellation. Our colleagues from Suhakam, the National Human Rights Institution of Malaysia, have been unable to present due to urgent work on investigation of a forced disappearance case. So in their absence, I will step in and give a brief introduction to the mandate of national human rights institutions and bring to the table some of the observations that they would otherwise have shared. Before I move on to that, let me introduce my co-panelists, if I now take on the panelist cap. Victor Joseph Urbanil from the Human Rights Commission of the Philippines. Victor is a development management officer. He works in the Commission's Economic, Social and Cultural Rights Center, a center dedicated to monitoring the government's compliance with international human rights obligations, particularly on economic, social and cultural rights. The center also works on research for protecting and promoting economic, social and cultural rights. So pleased to have you with us, Victor. Before I hand over to you, let me start myself by a little an expanded introduction to this panel by introducing the role and mandate of national human rights institutions. So national human rights institutions are established in 117 countries around the world. National human rights institutions are also known as NHRIs in the lingo that those of us who are familiar with them use. National human rights institutions are organized globally under the Global Alliance of National Human Rights Institutions, known as GANRI. GANRI also serves as an accreditation board, so to speak, and GANRI hosts an accreditation procedure to examine whether national human rights institutions are independent enough and have enough capacity to get the A status mark that truly independent and functional national human rights institutions get. So we have A status, B status, and C status national human rights institutions. And the importance of this system, of course, is the inbuilt drive towards actually reaching true independence. Obviously, a national human rights institution is only really fulfilling its mandate to monitor, protect, promote human rights if it is independent from a potentially critical government. Important to say also is that that national human rights institutions were established by the International Human Rights Conference in Vienna in 1993. And the core areas of the National Human Rights Institutions mandate as established by that conference is to promote and protect human rights, also to raise awareness on human rights, and to liaise with civil society, advise governments on advancing the compliance with national human rights instruments. And most national human rights institutions also handle complaints from citizens who experience that their rights are violated. So from this, it follows that when it comes to fishers, whom we have heard small-scale fishers are in many places a vulnerable population group, national human rights institutions are there to actually protect their rights, to promote their rights, to advocate for better policies, for better implementation of existing policies, etc. They are also mandated to conduct outreach and actually reach out to fishing communities, fishing dependent population groups, and raise their awareness on their rights as human beings, their human rights. And they are mandated to investigate further where there are human rights issues at stake, to conduct research and broader analysis on the situation among fishers, all, of course, with a view to advance the national respect for fishers' rights. So, to a few examples, the National Human Rights Institution in Malaysia goes under the name Suhakam. They had a few years back conducted an outreach and awareness raising program to fishing dependent communities in the state of Penang. They realized when they got there that these fishers, they were highly unaware of the fact that they were entitled to have their human rights, their basic rights respected. The awareness they gained after this awareness raising program led them to file a complaint with Suhakam. They complained that a commercial shellfish farmer had attempted to have them prosecuted for collecting mussels in a public area, public waters. He started raising his own cockles on a commercial farm on the water, and he sought to kick out the communities who had traditionally been using these public resources. The commission found, sorry, I'm mixing up here, very sorry, I am completely mixing up my notes. I will roll back, back to Penang. The situation in Penang was that this land reclamation that you see on the photograph, I think the picture speaks for itself. You see how the environment is being violated there by this land reclamation project, where what used to be a bay with marine resources for communities to use is being transformed into commercial land. It is the state, the Penang state government, that's running this project. And the local fishing community is highly critical of it and filed a complaint to the commission on their rights to fish and to conduct their traditional livelihood there in the waters were being undermined with this land reclamation being implemented. The Commission Suhakam found that they had good reason to complain that indeed their livelihood rights were being violated, and they started investigating the case with hearings, inquiries with all stakeholders in the area. And after that, conducting high-level dialogue with the state government. This high-level dialogue, as I understand, is still continuing. This has been going on for a couple of years. Yesterday, in preparation for this, I browsed a bit the newspapers from Malaysia, and I can see that it is still on the news. I can see that the high-level dialogue is continuing. Members of parliament, just the day before yesterday, a member of parliament came out and talked very strongly about these communities' livelihood and dignity being undermined by this land reclamation project. So an illustration of how the Human Rights Commission can be one of the voices to help bring out these issues when they arise. Over to the next slide, please, Sophie. And now we're going to the cockle farm. That is a Thailand case. I had made a mistake in my notes here, so that's why I messed up. I'm sorry about that. The case I want to share now briefly is from Thailand. It is shared by staff in the National Human Rights Commission of Thailand a couple of years ago when we met in a seminar. They received this complaint from a fishing community that a commercial shellfish farmer had set up his farm, similar to what you see in the picture, in a public area. He had set up this farm without any license to do so. And after that, he tried to kick out the local communities who were already using these resources and who had traditionally been using these resources. The Fishing Association of the area filed a complaint to the National Commission for Human Rights in Thailand about this case, saying that their rights to access resources they had always used were being violated. And actually, the Commission found that that there was a real human rights problem there, a human rights issue, and they started investigating a little bit, and then they found that the similar patterns of violations of communities' right to access resources that were key to their livelihood, marine resources that is, were found in different parts of the country, based on which they concluded that this was a systemic issue that needs to be addressed at the policy level, after which they formulated recommendations to the government to address this issue and safeguard communities' access to marine resources. And again, here it would have been nice to have our colleagues in Thailand speaking for themselves. They are not here, but again, newspaper browsing shows that this case is definitely still alive also in Thailand. From recent months, newspaper articles cover how some of these commercial cockle farms, mussel farms, are actually now being dismantled by authorities. So there is some development there, and you would need to consult sources in Thailand yourselves if you want to get to the bottom of this. But just to quickly illustrate again how a national human rights institution can be part of giving that visibility, raising that awareness, showing rights holders that they have an ally, and this is what the final slide here is about, national human rights institutions as allies of the rights holders who experience abuse or lack of fulfillment of their rights. So human rights institutions are there to be used. They can process complaints when rights are violated. They can facilitate remedy when communities' rights are being violated. They can report to international human rights mechanisms, as Sophie also stated in the beginning, and contribute to this increased visibility of the plight of small-scale fishers and the fact that there are human rights issues at stake here. They are mandated to have dialogues with their governments and advise governments on how to align policy and duty bearer practice with human rights norms and standards. And this is one area where national human rights institutions have a quite specific mandate as compared to other kinds of human rights advocates. So that mandate is there to be used too, and to address patterns of discrimination and abuse. And I'm now being told that I have also talked too much. Sorry about that. I hand over to you directly, Victor, to explain to us how the Commission of Human Rights in the Philippines have engaged in this sector. And needless to say, please be mindful of time. Over to you, Victor.
Yes. First of all, I would like to say thank you for inviting the Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights Center of the Commission on Human Rights for this. And I would like to say good afternoon, because it's already afternoon in the Philippines, and good morning. First off, next slide, please. I will not go already into detail about the mandates of the Commission on Human Rights, as Sile has already explained it thoroughly, very well. I would just like to add that the Commission on Human Rights has an A-level accreditation, and it is in full compliance of the Paris Principles. So it has the responsibility to regularly report and monitor human rights situations and violations, and recommend steps in advancing the realization of human rights and dignity for all. Next slide, please. So the center that I work with, the ESCR Center, is a specialist center of the Commission, which essentially monitors government's compliance on international human rights obligations, particularly on economic, social, and cultural rights. Next slide, please. So I would like to show a glimpse of how we have monitored, or what is the situation of fishers in the Philippines. So the fishers are one of the 14 basic sectors as identified by the National Anti-Poverty Commission. So the NAPC coordinates poverty reduction programs by national and local governments and ensures that marginalized sectors such as fishers participate in government decision-making processes. So it was created under the virtue of RA 8425 or the Social Reform and Poverty Alleviation Act. So as you can see, it is not so far, although it's a negative, it is not so far as the situation of fishers in other countries. 82 million Filipinos, they rely on fish each day, but still fishers are second poorest in the country with a poverty incidence of 34%, according to the Philippine Statistics Authority. So with this data that we have on hand, with the intent to manifest the scoping process and the experience of Filipino fishermen and their access of government services, particularly on social protection, the Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights Center initiated an exploratory paper on the right to social security of farmers and fisherfolk. Next slide, please. So we found out that, as I said, they are among the poorest in Philippine society. They are forced to venture beyond the 15-kilometer boundary. These are called municipal waters from which they are entitled to fish. So rising sea levels, vulnerability to climate change, which aggravates extreme weather events and changing ecosystems. These fishermen have to endure risks of criminalization in order to seek their daily catch. So, they have competition with large commercial scale fishing vessels. These commercial fishing vessels have a gross weight of around 3 tons or more. And it has been reported that on occasion, large commercial fishing vessels were allowed by municipal governments to fish within this 15-kilometer boundary. And also, the protection of natural fish habitats like mangroves, coral reefs have also dwindled the catch of fishers. So next slide, please. So in the situation monitoring that we did on the right to social security of farmers and fisherfolk, participants were organized by the regional office of the CHR through the help of civil society organizations. The participants hailed from the provinces of Compostela Valley, Davao Oriental, Davao Occidental, Davao del Norte, and Davao del Sur. So there were a total of 40 participants from different provinces, including participants from Davao City and sectoral representatives from NAPC. The focus group discussions were centered around the normative standards of the right to social security, as defined through several UN general comments, including comment number 13, 14, and 19. These standards were availability, accessibility, adaptability, acceptability, and adequacy. So, as you can see in the program, during the project itself, we were able to also connect the fishers to the social security system, so they can already be a member of the social security system of the Philippines. So next, please. Next slide. So what are the key findings that we found in the study? So there are good awareness of programs, but there is an endemic problem with the implementation of these programs. There is widespread issue of political accommodation for beneficiaries of 4Ps. 4Ps is the Pantawid Pamilyang Pilipino program, which is the flagship national social protection program of the Philippines. So political accommodation means that if you are friends with the political party or friends with the mayor, or you can easily be in this list, even though you are not poor or you are not fisher. So one of the conditionalities for being under the 4Ps was that children 5 to 18 need to have regular checkups from government health centers, but there is a lack of proper health centers or clinics near the area. So the travel to the nearest one is quite far. So, and then lastly, pump boats given by the Bureau of Fisheries and Aquatic Resources were also not well made. They said that usually they use common nails instead of bronze nails. So rust was a frequent issue. So what were the recommendations that we did, during the study? So first is to fix the system of choosing participants for the 4Ps program. So the participants recommended that the system of choosing need to be revalidated every 4 years, so that to ensure that only those who are really in need of this program are enrolled. So more health centers, clinics, and government agencies in geographically isolated and disadvantaged areas, stricter monitoring from the BIFAR, and for the Commission on Human Rights to continue to conduct monitoring and research activities, which would prevail stricter monitoring and evaluation of the efficiency and effectiveness of national social security and social protection programs. And also, we recommended that they institutionalize key government initiatives, which brings me to the next slide. I would not say that our study directly, this is the response directly to our study, but after the study we conducted, the Pantawid Pamilyang Pilipino program is now institutionalized as law in the Philippines. So farmers and fisher folks are now recognized as automatic members. They will also be recognized. There will also be a continuous impact assessment, so that the list has always to be clean and to safeguard against political accommodation. And there will also be a continuous monitoring of its implementation. Next slide, please. Another policy response was the Sagip Saka Act. Saka means farming in Tagalog. So agricultural and fisheries production, including fisheries and agri-based farm production, will be monitored. And then acquisition of farm and fishery machinery and equipment for farmers will be done through this law. So it also ensures that this law will help improve the quality of life of 10 million farmers and fisher folks by institutionalizing an enterprise program for them. So this study was done late in 2019. So as you know, the pandemic struck in 2020, and this prompted another center, the Gender and Equality and Women's Human Rights Center of the Commission on Human Rights, to conduct a study. Next slide, please.
Sorry, I don't have any more slides. I don't know if that was the problem, but
okay.
And I think we need to wrap up.
Okay, so I would just like to say that we also have a focus study on the situation of women fisher folks and women and girls at risk of violence. This was what my next slides would have been. The situation report of women fisher folks and women. This was done by another center, as I said, the Gender Equality and Women's Human Rights Center of the Commission on Human Rights. So I would just like to highlight some of the findings. So they said that traditional gender roles persist, which means that less women identify as fisher folk, because they said only those who sail out to sea are considered fisher folk and not women. There is a lack of sex disaggregated data. There is a lack of representation in fisher folk organizations of women. Most of them are only there to be in place for their husbands. And the majority are not aware of the Magna Carta of Women and the provision on the rights and benefits of women fishers. And the recommendations of the program were to ensure effective implementation of the Magna Carta for women, ensure access to information resources, training, and livelihood, establish, strengthen, support women fisher folks organizations, including sex disaggregated data, enhance training of violence against women desks in fisher communities, and enhance the capacities of women fisher folks rights training, including referrals and response in cases of gender-based violence, including the trafficking of women and girls. And lastly, my last slide, there are some efforts that I would like to highlight during the pandemic in April 2020, the CHR released a statement on the plight of farmers and fisher folks, asking that the government ensure that the lens of the government is seen through them, and that all local government units should allow the sector's access to their farms and municipal waters, and allow unhampered access to the distribution of fishing products. We also did an online meeting with the province of Bulacan regarding the fisherfolk communities affected by the Bulacan Airport project, which is going to be done by San Miguel. And then on July 2021, which is coming, we will have a human rights situation monitoring of fisherfolks in partnership with the Asian NGO Coalition. We are embarking on another round of monitoring, particularly noting the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic to their livelihood, their access to resources vis-a-vis the delineation of fishing areas, displacement, and human settlement. So that's all from the Commission.
Thank you very much, Victor, for highlighting some of the tangible engagement the Commission in the Philippines has had with the situation of fishers. Interesting new research you are mentioning here on the plight of fishers in the face of COVID-19. We are definitely, from our side, very keen to follow your developments around that, and I guess that others in the audience would have the same interest. So in order not to waste more time here, given that we're a bit behind schedule, I want to move over to the Q&A session now. I encourage the audience, to our participants here, to post your questions in the chat, and I will direct them to the panelists. Before I raise the first question here to our panelists that has already appeared, I want to let you know that I have been allowed by the organizers, TBTI, to go 5 minutes over time. So we will have time for a few questions, and we will have time for Anna's final remarks from the FAO. So one question that I wanted to raise, first of all, Victor talked about the situation of women fishers at the end, and how difficult it is for women fishers to organize, etc. We heard about it a bit also in some of the earlier presentations. How do we as human rights advocates promote the right of women fishers? I would like to ask the panelists if you have any comments on that. Manas, I guess you're aware of some of the global developments in this regard. What do you see? What kinds of trends and developments do you see when it comes to the visibility of women fishers and their organizing, etc.?
Thanks, Sile. I think that's a very important question. I think colleagues in Bangladesh as well brought up some egregious examples of sexual abuse and violence against women. I think at the international level, there's a lot of positive developments in terms of the participation of women in international fish worker organizations that are very engaged in the processes, both of the FAO and in other UN bodies. So coming back to that question of, first we need to visibilize the fish workers in this sector, and amongst them the most neglected or the vulnerable, including women and others. So that is one development, but there's also at the regional level, you see strong organizations such as in Africa, the Off-Fish Net group of women who are in the fish trade and fish vending business. So bringing them together to advocate, especially in some of the Eastern African countries such as Kenya, Tanzania, and others, that they're doing good work. But at the national level, I think these have to be looked at as broad rights-based entitlements that all women in these societies need to have. So sectorally, looking at it only sectorally, of course, it's important to do investigations and reports and advocacy, but I think we need strong institutions that can address marginalization and violence against women and ensure their dignity and rights at the national level through the courts, through the human rights institutions, and through cultural change as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Manas. I see one more question in the chat, which I want to take, and after that we move on. It's a question from Lena Westlund, who asks, I wonder if you see different human rights issues among the different subsectors along the value chain. That is not only the women who fish, but also women who work on the value chain or in other parts of the value chain. And would this depend on the work and the role they have as processors, or is it more linked to gender? So violations of women fishers or fishing dependent women's rights, is it more because they are women and then there's a whole set of injustices related in many societies to being a woman, or is it sector specific issues that we need to address? Do any of our panelists have a comment on that? Maybe Victor, do you have a comment on that?
From the research that our Gender Equality and Women's Human Rights Center did, I was thinking the human rights violations for women are across the value chain. They don't have much difference if they are women fishers or, as you said, post-processing. But their research also found that women are the face. They dominate post-processing activities for fishery. So you can say that the data will be skewed, that there will be more human rights violations for women in post-processing activities of fishers, because they are the face of that part of the value chain.
Thank you, Victor, for those reflections. In the interest of time, I'm afraid we need to move on. I can see there's one more question from Taiwan on a superstition that women cannot go on board, or there will be bad luck. We will close the Q&A now and move on to our speaker, Ana Suarez Dusan from the FAO. Ana is a consultant at the FAO, the Food and Agricultural Organization, and she works on the small-scale fisheries guidelines. So over to you, Ana. Please share with us your final remarks.
Thank you, Cecilia. Thank you to all the panelists for these very compelling presentations. I'll have to be a little bit quick because we don't have that much time. So I want to tell you from the FAO perspective, where are we now in terms of aligning fisheries policies with human rights standards, and perhaps give you some information of different examples of programs that we are working on that can help you to address these issues. So first, no, go back. I'm sorry, this is good. So first, as Manas was explaining, he gave an explanation about the SSF guidelines. So as you know, there are an instrument conceived and extensively consulted with fisheries and fisheries with fisheries actors themselves. And in them, the fisheries actors identify how they will want to make livelihoods along the entire value chain sustainable for themselves and for the planet. The recommendations put forward in the SSF guidelines address policies, strategies, and legal frameworks concerning small-scale fisheries, but also other matters of lives and livelihoods in fisheries communities. And they complement other international instruments and have to be implemented following a human rights-based approach. At the same time, implementing them contributes to achieving sustainable development goals, in particular SDG 14B, as Manas and Celia explained. We are working at the national level with consultants and several stakeholders in various countries, such as Tanzania, Namibia, and Uganda, to develop national plan of actions in support of the implementation of the small-scale fisheries guidelines. And we have developed a toolbox which describes the phases and approaches to develop and implement this national plan of actions. We are also conducting specific work on human rights in various countries, such as Tanzania and Uganda. In Tanzania, we're conducting a study to examine and identify the human rights issues in the sector. And in Uganda, we are working on mapping civil society organizations involved in promoting the human rights-based approach and assess their capacity to deliver their mandate. Next slide, please. We have also been working around the conception that national legal and policy frameworks need to target specifically small-scale fisheries sectors and their communities, considering the diverse dynamic context of the sector and the issues associated with it, and allow people in the sector to be part of the development of policy and legislation. We believe that using national legislation and policies to implement the small-scale fisheries guidelines is a tangible way to support the sector in attaining an adequate standard of living. So for this, FAO has developed two materials. One is the legislative guide legislating for sustainable small-scale fisheries that you can see now in the slide. And we are also working the development of a small-scale fisheries policy and legal diagnostic tool. So both of these materials were developed to assist national stakeholders who are interested in implementing the small-scale fisheries guidelines from a policy and legal perspective, and assess the extent to which the country has committed to fulfill the requirements of the SSF guidelines into their national policy and legislation. I have put here two examples. In the legislative guide, we have examples of how some countries have legislated for certain aspects. I put here two examples of a decree in Peru that recognize the recognition of small-scale fisheries, and there is a national innovative program on fisheries and aquaculture within the International People's Plan. And it's a program that advocates for innovation in fisheries and aquaculture activities and respect their ancestral rural rights to territories. And in Venezuela, there is also a decree that aims to protect settlements of small-scale fishing communities, protect the fishing grounds, and guarantee full social benefits and social security access. So in the legislative guide, you can find many examples of how countries have legislated for many aspects, including social protection, not that much on human rights, but hopefully we'll get there in the future. Thank you, Sophie. So I wanted to highlight three key messages of how we can all work together to address human rights, livelihoods, and dignity for small-scale fisheries. So first, we must ensure the effective participation of small-scale fisheries and their communities in creating and strengthening conducive political environment aligned with human rights. To enable this, a political environment that supports the diverse and traditional contributions of small-scale fisheries must receive a strong political commitment, and this must translate into adequate resource and capacity development, along with effective governance and adequate institutional arrangements, as we spoke just now. We also must work for the empowerment of small-scale fisheries and fish workers to ensure sustainable livelihoods. Small-scale fisheries and their organizations must be at the center of all decision-making process at all stages, including in their design, implementation, and monitoring. And this is essential to reduce political marginalization and adjust measures to the needs and challenges to these populations, improve access to social protection, and allow equitable participation in markets. To this end, like government have a very important role to play, as they have the responsibility to respect and protect human rights. And finally, we need to strengthen political coherence between the small-scale fisheries guidelines and other international instruments that must be read together. We need to highlight the importance of the international framework for small-scale fisheries, and in which way this international framework can be useful at the national level in addressing the different challenges identified in today's presentations. Even if we have several instruments that were developed at different times and with different thematic approaches, they do provide a coherent set of obligations for states. And the role of the SSF guidelines is kind of summarizing how all these obligations come together and to support and show how governments and small-scale fisheries sectors can work together in supporting the human rights-based approach. Next slide, please, Sophie. So as you know, 2022 will be International Year for Artisanal Fisheries and Aquaculture, and this will be a great opportunity to raise awareness to the human rights challenges for small-scale fisheries and ensure that their voices of right holders, in particular small-scale fishing communities, indigenous peoples, are heard and taken into account at the international, national, and local scales. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anna, for this comprehensive final remarks, and for sharing the work that you are now doing on promoting the actual application of the SSF guidelines, which is very important, and which is something we all here on the panel agree that there's a strong need to do. So really interesting to hear about your new tools to advance the actual policy development in countries. In closing, I want to just briefly say that I think the encouragement that I take away from the sharing that we've had here is that we see an increased visibility of the plight of small-scale fishers and the human rights issues they face. We also see that there's definitely a continued need to bring up these issues, and for us as advocates of their rights to cooperate around continuing the promotion of the rights to a decent livelihood, to dignity of small-scale fishers, to bring these issues up towards policymakers, towards also businesses working with fish. There's a need to organize the fishers themselves. There's a need to work on enforcing the regulations that already exist. And there's definitely a need for all of us to cooperate around these issues. So in conclusion, let me just say, let's all make the most of 2022, the year of artisanal fisheries. We have a good opportunity there to step up our efforts and to demand tangible change. So with this, I want to close this webinar and thank all panelists from your really enlightening and detailed presentations. I apologize, we went a bit over time, even a bit more than the 5 minutes I had been granted by TBTI. Apologies for that. But thank you very much for this time together. I leave enlightened, and I hope that everybody do. We will, from the DRHR, share some links to some of the resources that have been mentioned afterwards on our event page at the DRHR website. So looking forward to seeing you in future events in the virtual space, and maybe in real life at some point. Have a continued good day, everybody, or evening. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And stay in touch,
safe,
everyone.
Stay safe.
Quite
Thanks
late
a lot
for an
for your-
answer. Yeah.
Sorry?
No, I wanted to answer